Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. When I was 17, I spent the summer at my uncle's cabin in the woods. It wasn't far from our small town, but it felt like the middle of nowhere. My uncle had asked me to look after the place while he went on a fishing trip with his friends. I thought it would be fun to spend a week away from everything. No school, no parents, just me and the peace of the forest. The first couple of days were nice. I'd wake up to birds chirping, make myself breakfast, and spend the afternoons reading or hiking the trails near the cabin. There was no Wi-Fi, but I didn't mind. At night, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the sounds of the forest. The rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful. On the third night, though, things started to get strange. It was just after midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound wasn't the usual scurrying or rustling. It was deliberate. Heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led to the cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding. I told myself it was probably a hiker who got lost and needed help. But who hikes in the middle of the night? I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, careful not to make any noise. The porch light was on, casting a pale glow over the yard. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, just beyond the edge of the light, I saw a figure. It was tall and standing completely still, almost like a statue. I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell it was a person. They were just standing there, staring at the cabin. I froze, unsure of what to do. Should I call out to them? Lock the doors? Pretend I wasn't there? My uncle had a shotgun in the closet, but I didn't know how to use it, and the thought of holding a weapon made me feel sick. After what felt like hours, the figure moved. They took one step closer to the cabin, then another. My instinct screamed at me to hide, so I ducked down beneath the window. I sat there, holding my breath, listening to the sound of those heavy footsteps getting closer. Then, silence. I stayed there for a long time, too scared to move. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peek out the window again. The figure was gone. I didn't hear them walk away, but the yard was empty. I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked, then sat on the couch with a kitchen knife, shaking. The rest of the night was quiet, but I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just some random person passing through. Maybe they didn't realize someone was staying at the cabin and left when they saw the lights on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to spend the day outside, hoping the fresh air would calm me down. I hiked to a nearby stream, trying to distract myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. What did they want? Why were they there? When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The gravel path leading to the porch had been disturbed, as if someone had walked up and down it repeatedly. My stomach twisted. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept every light in the cabin on and stayed awake, listening for any sound. Around 2 a.m., it happened again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, just like before. This time, I didn't look out the window. I was too scared. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I whispered that someone was outside the cabin. "Stay on the line," she said. "An officer is on the way." As I waited, the footsteps grew louder. I could hear them circling the cabin, crunching on the gravel, then stepping onto the wooden porch. The boards creaked under the weight. Whoever it was, they were right outside the front door. I clutched the phone, barely breathing. Then, a loud knock echoed through the cabin. "Hello?" A deep voice called. "Is anyone home?" I didn't answer. My heart was racing, and I felt like I might pass out. Another knock, louder this time. "I'm not here to hurt you," the voice said. "I just need some help." I stayed silent, praying the police would get there soon. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. They were trying to get in. I backed away, clutching the kitchen knife, tears streaming down my face. The operator was still on the line, telling me to stay calm, that help was almost there. Then, just as quickly as it started, the noise stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the night. Moments later, I saw the flashing lights of a police car pulling up the driveway. The officers searched the area but didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably a drifter or a hunter who got lost, but their tone didn't convince me. They offered to stay until morning, but I declined. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things and drove back to town. My uncle said he'd never had any trouble out there before, but he believed me. He even installed security cameras around the cabin, just in case. To this day, I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, but I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps in the dark. When I was 16, my family moved into an old house on the edge of town. It wasn't a mansion or anything, just a two-story, slightly run-down place with a creaky floor and peeling wallpaper. My parents said it had character, but to me, it felt unsettling from the start. The air inside was heavy, like the walls had soaked up years of secrets. The basement was the worst part. It wasn't finished, just a dirt floor, stone walls, and a single dangling light bulb that barely lit the space. My dad joked that it was perfect for a horror movie, but even he didn't like going down there. The washer and dryer were in the corner, so we had no choice but to use it. Every time I had to go down to do laundry, I'd rush through it as quickly as possible, trying to ignore the creepy vibe. A few weeks after we moved in, weird things started happening. It was little stuff at first, doors creaking open on their own, strange cold spots in the house, and the occasional sound of footsteps when no one else was home. My parents brushed it off, saying the house was old and settling, but I wasn't so sure. One night, I was home alone while my parents went out to dinner. I was in my room, doing homework, when I heard a faint thump coming from downstairs. I paused, listening. Another thump, louder this time, followed by a scraping noise. I told myself it was just the house, but then it happened again. Thump, scrape. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving furniture in the basement. My heart started racing. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed downstairs, flipping on every light as I went. When I reached the basement door, I stood there for a moment, debating whether to open it. The noises had stopped, and the silence was almost worse. Finally, I mustered up the courage and turned the knob. The door creaked open, and I peered down the stairs. The light bulb was swaying slightly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the air was cold, colder than it should have been. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I stood there for another minute, then closed the door and locked it. Whatever was down there, I didn't want to know. I went back to my room and tried to focus on my homework, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The noises became more frequent after that. Every night, I'd hear faint thumps and scraping sounds coming from the basement. My parents insisted it was just the pipes or the wind, but I wasn't convinced. One evening, my best friend Emma came over to hang out. I told her about the noises, and she immediately wanted to investigate. Emma was braver than me. She loved ghost stories and horror movies. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I agreed. We waited until it was dark, then grabbed flashlights and headed to the basement. The air grew colder with each step we took. When we reached the bottom, Emma swung her flashlight around, illuminating the walls and the old furniture my parents had stored down there. At first, everything seemed normal. Then Emma pointed her flashlight at the far corner, and we both froze. There, in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and hunched, with glowing eyes that reflected the light. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at us. Emma grabbed my arm. "Let's go," she said, her voice trembling. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We didn't tell my parents. They wouldn't believe us anyway. But from that night on, I avoided the basement at all costs. Things got worse after that. I started seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, even during the day. Objects would move on their own. Books falling off shelves, chairs sliding across the floor. One morning, I found scratches on the basement door, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The final straw came a few weeks later. It was late at night, and I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, soft, raspy, and chillingly clear. "Come downstairs." I shot up, my heart pounding. The voice was coming from the hallway, but no one else was home. Trembling, I grabbed my phone and called Emma. "You have to come over," I whispered. "Something's in the house." Emma didn't hesitate. She showed up 15 minutes later, armed with a baseball bat. Together, we searched the house, but we didn't find anything. The basement door was locked, just as I'd left it. "Let's just go down there and end this," Emma said. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." I wanted to say no, to run out of the house and never come back. But I couldn't let Emma go down there alone. So, once again, we grabbed flashlights and descended into the basement. The air was colder than ever, and the light bulb flickered as we stepped onto the dirt floor. This time, the shadows felt alive, shifting and moving around us. My flashlight beam landed on the corner where we'd seen the figure before, but it was empty. Emma took a step forward, and that's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows in the corner began to twist and swirl, forming the shape of a figure. Its glowing eyes locked onto us, and it started to move closer. "Run!" Emma screamed. We sprinted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind us. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. For the rest of the night, we sat in the living room with every light in the house on, jumping at every little sound. The next day, I told my parents everything. They didn't believe me, of course, but I refused to stay in the house another night. I packed a bag and stayed with Emma until we moved out a few months later. To this day, I don't know what was in that basement. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by nature, that clears my mind. It's peaceful, almost therapeutic. But after what happened last summer, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot on a trail again. It was late July, and I had just gotten back from college for the summer. My parents' house is in a small mountain town surrounded by forests and hiking trails. One of my favorites was the Old Ridge Trail, a path that winds through thick woods and leads to a scenic overlook. It wasn't a popular trail, which was one of the reasons I liked it so much. That day, the weather was perfect, sunny, with a light breeze. I packed some snacks, water, and my phone, then set off for the trailhead. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, which in hindsight was my first mistake. But I'd hiked this trail dozens of times before, and I didn't think I'd be gone long. The first hour of the hike was uneventful. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patterns on the ground. I felt completely at ease. But then, about halfway up the trail, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just an eerie, unnatural silence. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out what had changed. The trees seemed different, taller, darker, and more closely packed together than I remembered. I told myself I was imagining things and kept walking, but the further I went, the more unsettling it became. The path, which was usually well-marked, started to fade. It narrowed, the dirt blending with the underbrush, until I could barely tell where it was anymore. That's when I saw it. A figure stood just ahead, partially hidden behind a tree. It was tall and thin, its limbs almost unnaturally long. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but something about the way it moved, slow, deliberate, almost jerky, made my skin crawl. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, as if it were waiting for something. I took a step back, and that's when it turned its head toward me. Its face was pale, almost featureless, with sunken black holes where its eyes should have been. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to trap me. The path was gone now. There was no trail, just an endless sea of trees. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to get away. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they might burst. Finally, I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar. The sun, which had been high in the sky when I started, was now barely visible through the thick canopy. How had it gotten so late? I pulled out my phone to check the time, but there was no signal. Of course, my heart was racing as I realized the full extent of my situation. I was lost, alone, and completely disoriented in a forest that suddenly felt alive and hostile. Then I heard it, a faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't one voice but many, overlapping and speaking in a language I didn't understand. The whispers seemed to come from all around me, circling closer and closer. I clutched my phone like it was a lifeline, scanning the forest for any sign of the figure. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and I realized they weren't just in the air. They were inside my head. I stumbled forward, desperate to get away from the sound. That's when I saw the cabin. It was small and ramshackle, with moss growing on the roof and broken windows. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though I hadn't seen or smelled any firewood burning. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to go inside. But the whispers were unbearable now, and the figure could still be out there. I didn't have much choice. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The cabin was empty, save for a wooden chair and a table in the center of the room. On the table sat an old, tattered journal. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the journal. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting, recounting the experiences of someone who had been lost in these woods. The entries grew more frantic as they went on, describing strange figures, vanishing trails, and whispers that wouldn't stop. The final entry read, "If you found this, it means you've seen them too. The forest isn't what it seems. Don't trust your eyes. Don't follow the whispers. And whatever you do, don't look behind you." A chill ran down my spine, and I slammed the journal shut. The cabin felt suffocating now, as if the walls were closing in. I needed to get out. I stepped outside, and the forest was even darker than before. The air was heavy, and the silence was oppressive. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. The trees seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking, rearranging themselves to keep me trapped. Then I heard it again, the whispers. They were closer now, louder and more insistent. I broke into a run, not caring where I was going. The forest seemed endless, the shadows stretching out to grab me. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing. The sky above was dark, but I could see stars through the gaps in the trees. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, covered in strange carvings that seemed to pulse faintly with light. I didn't want to get any closer, but my legs moved on their own. The whispers grew louder, almost chanting now, as I reached out to touch the stone. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, a blinding light erupted around me, and I felt like I was being pulled in every direction at once. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground near the trailhead. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal. But when I checked my phone, I realized it was 3 days later. I don't know what happened in those woods, and I don't think I ever will. But I've never gone back, and I've warned everyone I know to stay away from the old ridge trail. Whatever's out there, it doesn't want to be found. When I was 18, I volunteered at a community service program over the summer. The program sent teenagers to clean up abandoned buildings around the town and turn them into community spaces. Most of the assignments were pretty standard: old schools, warehouses, and rundown homes. But the one that stood out, the one that still gives me nightmares to this day, was the old hospital on the hill. The hospital had been closed for decades. My grandmother told me it had shut down after a fire in the late 1970s. Only part of the building had burned, but the damage was bad enough that they never reopened it. Rumors spread about what happened in that fire: people trapped in their rooms, patients who weren't rescued in time, and nurses who never made it out. The stories made it sound like a place where shadows lingered and where the walls remembered screams. When our group was assigned to clean the hospital, I wasn't thrilled. Neither were my friends, Sarah and Mike, who had also signed up for the program. But we didn't have a choice. The adults told us the hospital was safe to enter, and that we'd only be working on the first floor. No exploring, they warned, especially not in the West Wing. That part of the building isn't stable. We arrived on a cloudy morning, armed with gloves, garbage bags, and flashlights. The hospital loomed over us, its windows like dark, hollow eyes. The air was heavy, and even though it wasn't raining, the air felt damp. As we stepped inside, the smell of mildew and decay hit us like a wall. The hallways were lined with peeling paint, rusted wheelchairs, and broken gurneys. Faded signs pointed to rooms that no longer had doors. "This place is straight out of a horror movie," Mike whispered, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. "Let's just do the job and get out of here," Sarah replied, her eyes darting nervously around. We started in the main lobby, picking up trash and sweeping the floors. For the first hour, everything was fine. The building was creepy, sure, but nothing happened. It was just an old, abandoned hospital. Then, as we moved toward the East Wing, things started to change. It began with the sounds. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the broken windows, but it wasn't. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like distant footsteps echoing down the hall. Every now and then, I'd hear a soft shuffle or a metallic clang, like something had fallen over. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike nodded. "Probably just the building settling. Old places like this make noises." We tried to ignore it and kept working, but the noises didn't stop. They got louder, closer, and then there were the shadows. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch glimpses of movement, dark shapes flitting across the walls or ducking into doorways. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then Sarah froze in the middle of sweeping. "Did you see that?" she asked, pointing down the hallway. "See what?" Mike said. "There was someone at the end of the hall. They were standing there, and then they just disappeared." Mike laughed nervously. "You're just spooking yourself. There's no one here but us." But I believed her. I'd seen it too. We tried to focus on our work, but the atmosphere was oppressive. The air felt heavier, colder. It was as if the building was alive, watching us. Every noise, every flicker of light made my heart race. Then, the lights started to flicker. The overhead bulbs buzzed and dimmed, casting the hallways in eerie, shifting shadows. The flickering grew worse as we moved closer to the West Wing, the part of the hospital we were told to avoid. "We should head back," I said, my voice shaking. "We've done enough for today." But Mike, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "Come on, let's just take a quick look. What's the big deal? Are you insane?" Sarah hissed. "They told us not to go there." "It's just a building," Mike said, grabbing his flashlight. "What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, Sarah and I followed him. We stepped into the West Wing, and immediately, everything felt wrong. The air was colder, the shadows darker. The walls were scorched black from the fire, and the floor was littered with debris. Every step we took echoed loudly, as if the building were amplifying the sound. We reached a room with a rusted metal door hanging off its hinges. Inside, there was an old hospital bed, its mattress charred and springs exposed. A wheelchair sat in the corner, its wheels coated in dust. On the wall, faint but still visible, were handprints, blackened outlines of hands that seemed to stretch toward the ceiling. "That's creepy," Sarah whispered. Mike stepped closer to the bed, his flashlight sweeping the room. "It's just old fire damage. Nothing to be afraid of." As he spoke, we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from somewhere deeper in the wing, echoing faintly through the corridors. "Okay, now I'm officially freaked out," Sarah said, backing toward the door. "Let's go," I said, pulling on Mike's arm, but he didn't move. The tapping grew louder, turning into a slow, deliberate knock. It was coming from the room across the hall. Mike hesitated for a moment, then crossed the hallway and pushed the door open. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. The room was empty, but the knocking continued, louder now. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if something, or someone, was trapped inside. "Mike, let's go," I shouted, my panic rising, but before he could respond, the door slammed shut behind him. Sarah and I screamed, rushing to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. From inside, we heard Mike pounding on the door, shouting for help. "Get me out. Something's in here." We yanked on the door with all our strength, and finally, it flew open. Mike stumbled out, pale and trembling. "What happened?" I asked, but he just shook his head, too scared to speak. We didn't wait to find out more. We ran, down the hallway, through the main lobby, and out into the daylight. None of us said a word until we were back in the safety of Sarah's car. Mike finally broke the silence. There was something in there. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human. We reported the incident to the program supervisors, but they brushed it off as our imaginations getting the best of us. The hospital cleanup was quietly canceled a few weeks later, with no explanation. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that hospital, but I do know one thing. I'll never ignore a warning about a place like that again. Some buildings are better left abandoned, their secrets buried in the shadows. It was the summer after I graduated high school. My friends and I were trying to make the most of our last few months together before college scattered us in different directions. We spent our days swimming in the lake, driving down country roads, and staying out late, telling stories by bonfires. One night, someone brought up the old farmhouse on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for years, and like most small-town landmarks, it had a reputation. People said it was haunted, though the details were always vague. Whispers of strange lights in the windows, unexplained sounds, and the occasional daredevil claiming to have seen figures moving inside. "It's just an old house," my friend Jake said, leaning back in his chair. "Nothing scary about it." "Then why don't you prove it?" Sarah challenged, her eyes glinting mischievously in the firelight. Jake shrugged. "Fine, let's all go. Right now." The group went quiet for a moment, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of crickets. Finally, I spoke up. "If we're doing this, we stick together. No splitting up, no pranks. Deal?" Everyone nodded, though I could see a flicker of nervousness in a few faces. Still, the bravado won out, and we piled into 2 cars, heading for the farmhouse. The drive took about 15 minutes. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by overgrown fields. The moon was bright that night, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As we pulled up, the house loomed before us, 2 stories of weathered wood, its windows broken and its roof sagging. The front porch was caved in on one side, and the whole structure seemed to tilt slightly, as if bowing under the weight of its years. "Creepy, but not haunted," Jake said, stepping out of the car. His voice was confident, but I noticed him glancing around more than usual. We gathered our flashlights and approached the house. The wooden stairs creaked under our weight as we climbed onto the porch. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a dark interior that smelled of mildew and rot. "Ready?" Sarah asked, her voice a little too chipper. No one answered, but Jake pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The first room was a large, open space that might have been a living room once. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor, along with shattered glass and leaves that had blown in over the years. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling in long strips to reveal the wood beneath. A staircase led to the second floor, its banister broken and its steps warped. "This is so dumb," Jake said, but his voice was quieter now. We moved cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every step echoed, making the house feel impossibly large. In the kitchen, we found rusted appliances and a table that had collapsed under its own weight. A single chair stood upright in the corner, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. "That's creepy," Sarah muttered, shining her light on the chair. "It's just a chair," Jake said, though he didn't go near it. We explored the rest of the first floor, finding little more than dust and decay. Just as we were about to head upstairs, we heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps above us. Everyone froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "It's probably an animal," Jake said, but his face had gone pale. We listened, holding our breath. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate. They didn't sound like an animal. "Let's just leave," Sarah said, backing toward the door. But Jake, ever the skeptic, shook his head. It's nothing. Probably just the wind or the house settling. He started up the stairs before anyone could stop him. Reluctantly, we followed him, our footsteps careful on the creaking steps. The second floor was even darker than the first. The hallway stretched before us, lined with doors that led to what must have been bedrooms. Most of the doors were open, revealing empty, crumbling spaces. But one door at the end of the hall was closed. "Of course it's the creepy door," Sarah whispered. Jake moved toward it, and we followed, our flashlights trembling slightly in our hands. He hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was small, with a single window that let in a sliver of moonlight. In the center of the room was a bed frame, its mattress gone. On the wall above it, someone had scrawled something in dark, jagged letters. It looked like it had been written with charcoal, maybe burned into the wall. "What does it say?" I asked, stepping closer. The writing was faint but legible. "Leave and don't look back." "Okay, that's enough," Sarah said, turning toward the door. "We're leaving." But as she stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind her. We screamed and rushed to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Sarah pounded on the other side, shouting that she couldn't get it to open either. "Hold on," Jake yelled, throwing his weight against the door. It creaked but didn't give. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from inside the room with us. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the walls, but there was nothing there. The growling grew louder, reverberating through the room. "Open the door," I screamed, my voice cracking. Suddenly, the door flew open, and Sarah stumbled back inside. Her face was pale, and she was shaking. "What happened?" Jake asked, grabbing her by the shoulders. "There was someone in the hall," she whispered. "They walked toward me, but when I shined my light, there was no one there." We didn't wait to hear more. We bolted down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until we reached the cars. As we scrambled inside, I glanced back at the farmhouse. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw a figure, a tall, shadowy shape, standing perfectly still. We didn't speak much on the drive back. No one wanted to admit what we'd seen or heard, but none of us ever went near that farmhouse again. A few months later, I looked it up, curious about its history. What I found still haunts me. In the 1930s, the house had belonged to a family of 4. One night, the father had killed his wife and children before hanging himself in the upstairs bedroom, the same room where we'd seen the writing on the wall. Some places carry their history like a wound, and some wounds never heal. That farmhouse was one of those places, and I'm just glad we got out before we became part of its story. It started with my cousin Rachel. She was always the brave one, the one who thought rules were made to be broken and that fear was just an excuse for not trying something new. I admired her for it, though sometimes her fearlessness got her into trouble. That's why, when she called me late one night sounding terrified, I knew something was wrong. "Can I come over?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I can't stay here tonight." "Of course," I said, concerned. "What happened?" "I'll explain when I get there," she said, and hung up before I could ask anything else. When Rachel arrived, she looked pale and exhausted. She hadn't even bothered to change out of her pajamas, and her hair was a mess. She sat on my bed and rubbed her hands together nervously, like she was trying to warm herself up. "Okay, spill," I said. "What's going on?" She hesitated for a moment, then said, "It's going to sound crazy. Try me." Rachel took a deep breath. "You remember that antique mirror I bought last month? The one from the flea market?" I nodded. She'd been so proud of that mirror, with its ornate golden frame and slightly warped glass. It was old, probably from the 1800s, and she'd gotten it for a steal. "Well," she continued, "it's not normal." "Not normal how?" I asked, frowning. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting something to be lurking behind her. "It started a couple of weeks ago. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I'd see movements in the reflection, like shadows passing behind me, even when I was alone. I felt a chill run down my spine but said nothing, letting her continue. Then, the noises started, she said. Whispers, faint but clear, coming from the mirror. They were too quiet to make out the words, but I swear, it felt like they were calling to me. Rachel, I began, but she cut me off. I'm not crazy, she said firmly. Last night, it got worse. I was brushing my hair before bed, and I saw something in the reflection. It wasn't me. What do you mean? I asked, leaning closer. She lowered her voice to a whisper. It looked like me, but it wasn't. Its face was wrong, twisted, like it was smiling too wide. And its eyes, they were empty, black, like there was nothing inside. It just stood there, staring at me, even though I wasn't moving. I stared at her, unsure of what to say. Rachel wasn't the type to get spooked easily, and the fear in her eyes was real. What did you do? I asked. I turned around, she said, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, it was normal again. I couldn't sleep after that. I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay in that house. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to believe Rachel, but another part of me thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. Still, I didn't want to dismiss her fears outright. Do you want me to come with you tomorrow and check it out? I offered. She hesitated, then nodded. I don't want to go back alone. The next day, we drove to Rachel's house. It was a small place, cozy and full of her eclectic decorations. The mirror was in her bedroom, leaning against the wall opposite her bed. Even in the daylight, it had an unsettling presence. The golden frame gleamed, but the glass seemed darker than it should have been, like it was hiding something. There it is, she said, stopping in the doorway. I approached the mirror cautiously, my reflection staring back at me. It looked normal, just me, wearing my favorite hoodie, my hair slightly messy. I waved my hand, and my reflection did the same. It's just a mirror, Rachel, I said, trying to sound confident. She didn't reply. When I turned to look at her, she was staring at the mirror with wide eyes. What is it? I asked. Look closer, she whispered. I turned back to the mirror and froze. My reflection was smiling, but I wasn't. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The smile on my reflection's face faded, and it matched my expression again. I blinked, wondering if I'd imagined it. Did you see it? Rachel asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, I said. Maybe. It's not your imagination, she said. That's what I've been dealing with. I wanted to get rid of the mirror right then and there, but Rachel hesitated. What if breaking it makes things worse? She said. I've seen enough horror movies to know how that goes. Then what do we do? I asked. I don't know, she admitted. We decided to leave the house and figure it out later. Rachel stayed with me again that night, but neither of us slept much. Over the next few days, things got worse. Rachel said she could feel the mirror calling to her, even when she wasn't home. She started hearing whispers at my place, too, soft, insistent voices that seemed to come from nowhere. One night, I woke up to find her standing in the middle of my room, staring at the wall. Rachel? I whispered. She didn't respond. I got out of bed and gently shook her shoulder. She blinked and looked at me, confused. What are you doing? I asked. I don't know, she said, her voice shaky. I must have been sleepwalking, but her hands were cold, and her eyes looked distant, like she wasn't entirely there. We decided to research the mirror, hoping to find some clue about its origins. Rachel remembered the name of the flea market vendor she'd bought it from, and after a few phone calls, we tracked him down. When we explained the situation, his face went pale. I knew I should have gotten rid of that thing properly, he muttered. What do you mean? I demanded. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. That mirror belonged to a woman named Eleanor Barnes. She lived in a big house outside of town, all alone, and people said she was into strange things, occult stuff. After she died, the house was cleared out, and the mirror ended up in my shop. Why didn't you tell me this when I bought it? Rachel asked angrily. Would you have believed me? He countered. I thought it was just a story, but when I had it in my shop, weird things started happening. Things moving on their own, cold spots, that sort of stuff. I was glad to sell it and be done with it. What do we do now? I asked. The man hesitated. You need to destroy it. Burn it, if you can. But be careful. It won't go quietly. We returned to Rachel's house that night, armed with a hammer and lighter fluid. The mirror seemed to sense our intent. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows deepened. As we approached, the glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. Do it, Rachel said, her voice shaking. I raised the hammer and swung. The glass shattered, but instead of falling to the floor, the shards seemed to dissolve into smoke. The room filled with a high-pitched screech, like metal grinding against metal. Burn it, I shouted, grabbing the lighter fluid. Rachel doused the frame, and I lit a match, tossing it onto the wood. Flames erupted, but the screeching grew louder, almost unbearable. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure in the fire. A woman with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Then, as suddenly as it started, it was over. The fire burned out, leaving only ashes where the mirror had been. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive presence was gone. Rachel moved out of her house a week later. She didn't want to risk staying, even though the mirror was gone. As for me, I can't look at a mirror the same way anymore. Every time I catch my reflection, I can't help but wonder if it's really me or something else watching from the other side. It's on the outskirts of town. Nothing special, just a basic two-story home. But there was one thing that had always bothered me, something I couldn't shake since I was a little kid. The room at the end of the hall. It was a small room, with no real purpose. It was always locked, and my parents would never speak of it. As I grew older, my curiosity grew with me, but I never had the courage to ask why it was locked or what was inside. On this particular night, something was different. Mark and I were sitting in the living room, playing video games, when I noticed that my parents had left the house for the evening. They'd mentioned something about running errands and wouldn't be back until late. I had the house to myself. I wasn't sure why I decided that tonight would be the night I'd finally find out what was behind that door. Maybe it was the silence that made the house feel too empty. Maybe it was because I felt like I was old enough now to handle whatever secrets my parents had hidden away. Whatever the reason, I stood up and walked toward the stairs. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dimly lit, and the door at the end was just barely visible in the distance. The door was old, with a tarnished brass doorknob, and the paint had started to peel around the edges. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it. Every time I had walked past this door, there had been an unspoken rule to avoid it. It wasn't a fear of the door itself, but a fear of what might be on the other side. The door was locked, of course. It always was. But tonight, something was different. The key was gone from its usual spot, but the door itself seemed lighter, as if the lock had been tampered with or even removed. I pushed the door gently, and to my surprise, it creaked open. The room inside was exactly as I remembered it, dark, musty, and covered in dust. The air was thick, and I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me, though the room was empty. There were no windows, and the only light came from the dim glow of the hallway behind me. At first glance, it looked like just another storage space. There were old boxes stacked in the corners, a few unused furniture pieces covered with sheets, and piles of old newspapers scattered around. But there was something else in the far corner, something I had never noticed before. A large, dark shape, almost like a piece of furniture, but too big to be a normal object. It was covered by a thick, heavy tarp. I stepped closer, my heart racing. There was an odd feeling in the room, like the air had grown heavier the longer I stood there. The tarp seemed to shimmer slightly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was under it wasn't just a piece of old furniture. It was something more. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pulled the tarp off. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't a bad smell, per se, but it was a scent that reminded me of something ancient, like old books, damp wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. I stepped back, surprised at what I found underneath. It was a large, full-length mirror, the kind you might find in a fancy dressing room. The frame was old and ornate, made of dark wood that looked almost like it had been carved by hand. The glass was dull, like it hadn't been cleaned in years, but it was still reflective. What caught my attention was the way it seemed to almost shimmer, like the surface wasn't quite flat. I ran my fingers along the edge of the mirror, brushing away the dust. The reflection in the glass was distorted, not quite right. I didn't look like myself. At first, I thought it was just the lighting or the angle, but as I stared harder, the reflection seemed to move in a way that I didn't. I looked away quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was ridiculous, I told myself. It was just a mirror. It didn't mean anything. But even as I thought that, the reflection in the glass seemed to move again, slowly, like it was reaching out. I wasn't sure why I decided to take it down, but somehow I found myself hauling the mirror off the floor and dragging it toward the door. The closer I got to the hallway, the heavier it seemed to get. By the time I reached the doorway, I could barely hold on to it. As I stepped out into the hall, I glanced at the mirror again, and this time I saw something I couldn't ignore. The reflection wasn't just of me anymore. It was of the hallway behind me, but the hallway was different. It was darker, longer, and the door to the room at the end of the hall was now open. I froze. I turned around quickly, expecting to see something behind me, but the hallway was still the same, dim and empty, the way it had always been. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was just imagining things. But when I looked back into the mirror, the reflection of the hallway remained unchanged. I tried to step back, but my foot caught on the edge of the carpet, and I stumbled forward. The mirror crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The room seemed to fall silent. The shattered glass lay at my feet, but as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The pieces of glass weren't reflecting light as they should. Instead, they seemed to absorb it, growing darker the more I stared at them. I took a step back, my heart racing, and then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, but distinct. It was coming from the room at the end of the hall. At first, I thought I was hearing things, but then the whisper became clearer. "Come closer." I turned around, panic rising in my chest. The door to the room at the end of the hall was wide open now, and the darkness inside seemed to stretch beyond what should have been possible. "Don't go in," I whispered to myself, but my legs weren't listening. I found myself walking toward the door, as if something was pulling me. My breath came in short gasps, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As I approached the door, the whispering grew louder, and I could almost hear my name being called from the other side. I stood in the doorway, unable to turn away. The room was pitch black, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, like something was waiting inside. I stepped forward, and as I did, the door behind me slammed shut, the sound so loud it rattled my bones. I spun around, panic flooding my mind. The door was locked, and there was no way to escape. "Who's there?" I shouted, but the only response was the sound of my own breath echoing back at me. I turned back toward the darkness ahead. The air was cold now, frigid, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I stepped further into the room, my hands shaking as I reached out, trying to make sense of the space. And then I saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing motionless in the center of the room. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it was watching me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure stepped forward, and I saw its eyes, or what I thought were eyes. They were dark, empty sockets, and as they moved toward me, I felt my heart stop. "No," I whispered. The figure reached out, its hand brushing against my face, cold and sharp. I gasped and stumbled backward, but it was too late. The darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up in my own bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. My bedroom was exactly as I had left it, and there was no sign of the mirror or the figure in the room at the end of the hall. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but every time I looked at the door at the end of the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me. I told myself it had all been a nightmare, but deep down, I knew that something in that room wasn't finished, and somehow, I knew I would be seeing it again. It was the end of summer when we moved into the house on the corner of Maple Street. My parents were excited. They'd been talking about it for months. For me, it was just another new house, another new beginning that I didn't want. I didn't mind the neighborhood. It was quiet, with big trees and small yards. But there was something about the house that didn't sit right with me from the start. It was old, really old. The kind of house that had creaky floorboards and a smell that didn't seem to go away no matter how much you cleaned. My parents didn't seem to mind it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We'd only been living there for a week when I first heard it. It was late at night, and I couldn't sleep. I had been tossing and turning for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling of my new room, the darkness swallowing everything. My brother, Daniel, was already asleep in the room next to mine, and I could hear the faint sound of his snoring through the wall. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I was just about to close my eyes and drift off when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the wall. I froze. It wasn't the sound of mice, or maybe it was, but it felt different. It was rhythmic, deliberate. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and pops. But then I heard something else, soft, almost like whispering. I didn't move. My heart started to race, and I pulled the covers tightly around me, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the whispers, they didn't stop. They seemed to come from within the walls, and they were getting louder. "Help me," I heard, barely a whisper, like someone was pleading. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just the wind, or the house shifting. Maybe I was imagining it all. But then, there it was again. "Help me," louder this time. I got up, my legs shaky beneath me, and went to the door. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should wake my parents, but I didn't want them to think I was just scared of a house noise. I crept quietly into the hallway, the air thick with silence. The sound of scratching seemed to come from the walls of the hallway too, leading me toward the staircase. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening. The whispers were now louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to tell myself that it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I didn't mention what happened to anyone. I told myself it was just a bad dream, that I had imagined the whispers and scratching. But as the days passed, the sounds continued. Each night, they grew more frequent, more insistent, like they were trying to get my attention. One evening, after dinner, I sat alone in my room, my door cracked open, as usual. I didn't expect to hear anything, but the moment the lights went out and the house grew still, I heard it again. The whispering. I stood still, my heart pounding in my chest, listening. This time, the voice was clearer, more distinct. It was coming from the corner of the room, from the wall beside my bed. "Let me out, please," the voice begged. I couldn't breathe. I turned toward the wall, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I walked slowly toward it, my hands trembling. I placed my hand on the wall, as if trying to reach the voice. But there was nothing but the cold, hard surface of the wall beneath my palm. The voice continued, pleading, begging for help. But there was no one else in the room. "Mom, Dad," I shouted, my voice shaking with fear. But when I turned around, no one came. I was starting to lose my mind. I couldn't sleep anymore. Every night, the whispers would get louder, closer, and more desperate. I had to do something. One afternoon, while my parents were out, I decided to investigate. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like if I could just find the source of the voice, I could stop it. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and headed toward the basement. The walls in the basement were covered in old shelves, stacked with boxes of things my parents hadn't unpacked yet. The air was damp, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. I knew that if I could just find the spot where the voice was coming from, I could stop it. I moved the shelves around carefully until I found a small door I'd never noticed before. It was hidden behind some old furniture, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was a rusty, old handle on it, and it didn't open easily, but after a few hard tugs, the door creaked open. Inside, it was dark. I shone the flashlight around the room, and my heart skipped a beat. It was another room, a small, unfinished space with dirt floors and walls that had been left half-painted. The air inside was stale, and there was a strange, sour smell. It felt wrong, like something was off. I walked in, the beam of light sweeping over the room. At first, it looked empty, but then I saw something, a mark on the wall, a strange symbol, scratched into the paint, almost like it had been carved into the wall with something sharp. I stepped closer, my heart racing. The symbol looked familiar. It was almost like the kind of thing you'd see in old books about ghosts or curses. I shivered, not knowing why, but the feeling that I had just found something I shouldn't have was overwhelming. I had to leave. I turned to go, but just as I did, I heard it again. The voice, louder now, coming from behind the wall. "Help me, please. Let me out." I scrambled backward, my flashlight dropping to the floor as I backed away from the wall. My mind raced. What was going on? What was in the wall? Why did it sound like it was coming from someone trapped in there? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what I had discovered. What had I heard in the basement? What did the symbol mean? I knew I had to tell my parents, but something held me back. Would they believe me? They never seemed to hear the whispers, never seemed to notice the strange things happening in the house. Suddenly, I heard it again. The voice, louder now, right outside my door. "Let me out, please." I sat up, terrified. The voice was coming from the walls again, but this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was loud, desperate. I jumped out of bed and ran toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could get to it. I rattled the handle, but the door wouldn't open. I turned around, panicking, and the voice came again. "Help me." I screamed for my parents, but no one came. The voice continued, louder and more urgent. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting, calling me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, my parents found me standing in the hallway, wide-eyed and pale. I don't remember how long I had been standing there, but when I finally spoke, all I could say was, "We have to leave." My parents didn't take me seriously. They thought I had been having nightmares, or that I was just scared of the new house. But I knew what I heard. I knew what was in those walls. That afternoon, my parents left me alone at home while they ran some errands. I couldn't stay there anymore. I knew something had to be done. I needed answers. I couldn't ignore the voice anymore. I went to the basement again, determined to find out what was causing the whispers. When I reached the hidden room, I noticed something new. A crack had formed in the wall where the symbol was carved. I pushed against it, my heart racing, and the wall gave way, revealing a small, dark space behind it. Inside the space, I found something strange. Old newspapers, yellowed with age, and photographs of a family I didn't recognize. And there, in the corner, was a small, wooden box. I opened it, my hands trembling, and inside was a small key. As I held the key in my hand, I realized with chilling certainty that it wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was something far older, something that had been buried long ago. And now, it was calling to me, begging me to unlock what had been sealed away. I knew then that I couldn't leave, not until I uncovered the truth about the voice in the walls. It was a Thursday evening when I decided to drive out to the old cabin. My friends had been talking about it for weeks, but I'd always brushed it off as just another dare. The cabin had been abandoned for years, sitting on the outskirts of town where the forest thickened and the roads got quieter. I had heard rumors about it, that people went missing around the area, that strange things had happened in that cabin, but I'd always chalked it up to people's overactive imaginations. But this time, something felt different. I wasn't exactly sure why I felt compelled to go. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the fact that no one else would. Either way, by the time I grabbed my jacket and keys, I was already out the door. The drive was longer than I expected. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting everything in that eerie twilight that seems to make the world feel like it's holding its breath. The cabin was deep in the woods, past where the paved roads ended and the dirt trails began. My car's headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the twisted trees lining the path. It wasn't just the isolation that bothered me. It was the unsettling quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, where you can hear the wind rustling through the trees, but the kind where you feel like the world is holding something back, watching you, waiting. I finally made it to the cabin around 9. The road had become barely passable in the last mile, and I had to park the car a little farther than I would have liked. The cabin loomed ahead, half hidden by overgrown bushes and tall, gnarled trees. It looked worse up close than it had in the pictures. A dilapidated building, the roof sagging in places, the windows shattered and boarded up. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I ignored it and got out of the car. The moment I stepped onto the ground, I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel behind me. I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see a friend or someone from town, but there was nothing, just the empty road, stretching back into the dark. I shook my head. I must have been hearing things. Taking a deep breath, I made my way up the porch steps, which creaked underfoot. I knocked on the door. Like there was any reason to do that, considering no one had lived here in years. When the door didn't open, I pushed it lightly and it creaked inward, revealing a musty interior. The room inside was a mess. Old furniture was scattered haphazardly, half collapsed and covered in dust. Broken windows let in the cold night air. There were strange marks on the walls, like claw marks, deep and jagged. I could barely make out the shape of a fireplace against the far wall, its hearth empty and dark. The air smelled stale, like something that hadn't been touched in a long time. But it wasn't the disrepair that caught my attention. It was the silence. The stillness of the place was suffocating. I stepped inside cautiously, half expecting the floor to cave in beneath me. I shone my flashlight around the room, its beam flickering as if struggling to find something to focus on. I started walking further into the house, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The cabin seemed to stretch on longer than I expected, the hallways twisting and turning in odd angles, like it had been built to confuse you. Suddenly, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoing through the house. I stopped, listening. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound was too distinct to ignore. I turned toward the hallway. The footsteps weren't coming from the floor above or behind me. They were coming from somewhere within the house, as if someone was walking just a few steps away, yet out of sight. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. The noise grew louder, almost like someone was pacing back and forth. I took a step forward, my breath shallow in my chest. As I made my way down the hallway, the temperature seemed to drop. My flashlight flickered once again, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then, just as I reached a small room at the end of the hall, I heard the most unsettling sound of all, a door slamming shut somewhere deeper within the house. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling in the dead silence. I didn't expect an answer, but the echo of my own voice was all I heard. I took another step, my instincts telling me to turn back, but I didn't. Instead, I pressed on, pushing open the door at the end of the hall. Inside, the room was smaller than I expected, but it was more unnerving. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily in what looked like dried blood. On the floor, an old rug was rolled up in the corner, but what caught my eye was what lay beneath it, a trapdoor. The moment I saw it, a heavy feeling settled in my chest. I didn't know why, but something told me that whatever was under there shouldn't be disturbed. My curiosity, however, got the better of me, and I kneeled down to lift the trapdoor. I could barely see anything below, but a sharp, foul odor wafted up, something rotting. I hesitated for a moment, but then the sound came again. The same pacing, now closer, almost behind me. I jumped up, heart pounding, and spun around, expecting to see something or someone. But once again, there was nothing. It wasn't just the silence. It was the emptiness, the fact that I was not supposed to be here. I slammed the trapdoor shut and backed toward the door, my breath shallow. The air felt thick, and it was as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. The house was starting to feel alive, but not in a normal way. I heard the footsteps again, but this time, they were faster, more frantic. They seemed to be closing in on me, and I felt an icy hand of panic grip my chest. I turned to run, but the hallway stretched impossibly long. the doorways now endless, twisting into dark corridors. My mind raced. The house was changing, bending reality itself. I ran in the opposite direction, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The floor seemed to move beneath my feet, uneven and shifting. I couldn't tell where I was going anymore. The walls seemed to pulse with each step, and the whispers had returned. "Leave," a voice hissed, low and guttural. "Leave now." I didn't stop. I didn't even dare to look behind me, but I could hear the footsteps again, louder now, as if someone, or something, was chasing me. I sprinted down the hallway, my body aching, but I couldn't find the door. The way out wasn't there. The walls closed in tighter, and I stumbled, almost falling to the floor. Then, I heard the final sound that shattered everything. A loud bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping along the floor behind me. I ran faster, heart hammering in my chest, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I burst into the main room of the cabin and saw the front door, the only thing that could possibly give me escape. I threw it open, not caring if it was too late or what waited outside. But I didn't look back. The wind was howling now, almost as if it were urging me to leave. Without a second thought, I ran to my car, jumping in and slamming the door shut. My hands shook as I started the engine, not even glancing at the rearview mirror. I pressed the gas pedal down and sped down the gravel road, not looking back until the cabin was nothing but a shadow in the distance. When I finally made it home, I tried to forget everything I had seen and heard. I didn't tell anyone about the cabin. I didn't want to believe it. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I had just gotten scared in an old house. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the footsteps, and sometimes, even now, I hear them again. The soft scrape of something moving in the dark, something following me, something waiting. The house isn't empty, and neither am I.